Which is the best aperture for corporate portraits and headshots? In this video, I'm going to run through all the pros and cons of using different apertures and give you some suggestions as to which aperture you might want to use for your portraits. So let's get into it. Hey, it's Adrian Harrison here. I've been shooting professionally since 2007. In this channel, I want to share with you my knowledge about shooting so I can help you guys improve your photos, whether that's for your website, your business, or for your clients. Before we get into the best aperture to use for your portraits, let's talk about what aperture actually is. So in a lens, there's obviously a hole in the middle of the lens and that lets light in, and the size of that hole can be controlled, and that's what the aperture actually is. So the hole will let more or less light in depending on what setting and or how you've set the camera up. And the purpose of having an adjustable aperture like that is to manipulate the depth of field that you get. So depth of field is how much focus you get in any given shot. One of the things I would say to you is there actually a best aperture? I use certain apertures when I take my photos, but that's a creative choice that I make to get the outcome in the photo that I want. The aperture that you choose is really going to be entirely up to you and your vision as the photographer as to what you want to create. So perhaps you like to have the background completely out of focus. So in which case you're going to want to choose a very large aperture, which is kind of reverse as far as the numbering system goes. So like a 5.6 aperture, an f-stop of 5.6 is going to be a much larger hole than an f-stop of f16, for example, which is going to be a very small hole. So at the high numbers, the high f-stops like f16, you're going to get a very deep depth of field. So it means when you're taking a portrait, for example, all the person will be in focus, the background, a lot of the background will be in focus if you shot it at f16 versus if you shot it at something like f4 or f2.8, then you're only going to get a very small amount of focus. The next thing to realize is when you're looking to choose which aperture is that there's a couple of other things that affect how much focus that you get. And they are the distance of the subject from the lens and also the focal length of the lens. A very long focal length, like a 200mm lens, for example, or a long telephoto lens, will mean that you're going to get less depth of field in your photo. Even in relative comparison, I should say, to, let's say, a 50mm lens. So the lens choice is going to have a big impact on how blurry your background's going to be. The other thing that really affects the depth of field is the distance between the lens and the camera. If you're a long way away from the subject, let's say you're 20 meters away or 60 feet away, you're going to have a lot of trouble blurring the background. You probably won't be able to blur it very much. But if you're very close, let's say 6 feet or a couple of meters away, then you're going to be able to normally blur the background a lot more easy, especially when you choose a large aperture like f5.6 or f4 or f2.8. It's going to be much easier to blur that background. What apertures do I use when I'm taking my portraits? Well, I normally use a 100mm macro lens for a lot of my corporate portraits. So most of my portraits are going to be headshots or half body. And I find with a lens like this, I can be maybe 3 meters away from a subject, which is, what's that, about 10, 11, 12 feet away from a subject. And I can shoot their head down to about their waist, and I can blur the background out quite comfortably at f5.6. 5.6 for me with this particular lens and the distance that I am away from my subject works pretty well, because at that distance and at that aperture you're going to get very sharp eyes, but you're going to get some fall off towards the back of the head, so it's going to start softening, so from about the ears backwards. A lot of people think that you need to be shooting at a really, really big aperture like 1.2 or something crazy. What I've found is, especially working professionally, is it's imperative that I get the shot in focus. And if you're shooting at those really large apertures, if your subject so much as moves this much forward, that can be the difference between nailing the focus and not nailing it. And I can't really waste the time not nailing the focus. And also, I can't send images back to my client that aren't super sharp. So I found that f5.6 is an excellent focal length, so you're still going to blur out the background, but it's going to give you a bit of flexibility in that if your subject does move a little bit between you when you focus and when you press the shutter, that they're still going to stay fairly in focus. Another good aperture that I like to use is f4, and sometimes I actually even will use f2.8 or f2.5 when I'm using a wider angle lens, like a mid-range sort of lens, like a 50mm lens, for example. When you're using a 50mm lens, the background doesn't blur anywhere near as much. So to summarize, what you need to consider when you're deciding on the best aperture for your portraits is how much of the subject do you want to be in focus, and how much of the background do you need to be in focus. If it's a lot, then you need to choose a larger f-stop, maybe f8, f9, whatever it is that you're doing, that's going to suit the purpose. If you want more of the background blurred, then choose a larger aperture or a smaller f-stop number like f5.6 or f4. They're normally perfect, especially when you're using that lens. Just watch the distance between you and the subject, as that's going to affect how much the background blurs as well, and also keep an eye on the focal length of the lens that you're using. What I find with corporate portraits is 100mm or even an 85mm lens, they tend to flatter the face a lot, those focal length lenses, and they're great for corporate portraits. Well, that's it guys, thank you for watching, and if you did like this video, please give it a thumbs up and remember to subscribe below to the channel. And leave me your comments as to which apertures that you like shooting. I'd like to hear all about what you find is a really good aperture for taking your portraits.